Kaya. Kaya Wanju, Nankwell, Simon Forrest, Burungu. I'm a Wajak Baladong Nunga with kin connections to Parimaya and Wongatha peoples. Kaya Wanju Nidja Katanini, Curtin University, Wajak Nunga Bunya. Hello and welcome to this place of learning, Curtin University, on the land of the Wajak Nunga of the Swan Coastal Plain and east beyond the hills. I am of this land and place. I was born to this land. I follow a bloodline of people who have lived, walked and cared for this land we know as Wajak Nunga Bunya for over 1,000 generations. Our culture and knowledge of this landscape continue today even after the intrusions of the last 192 years. We Indigenous Australians are the first of the first peoples, the firstborn of all peoples, the first people to create human societies, the first people to create nations, the very first nations, the oldest continuing culture and knowledge system on this planet. And appropriately today, here, now, and in this place, the first voice you hear is that of a First Nations voice. As the first and continuing custodians of Mother Earth in this place, we acknowledge that all peoples are in a sense custodians of Mother Earth while we are here. Mother Earth has a lot to say if you are willing to listen. Australia is one of the most culturally diverse nations on our planet, and it is the cultural diversity that makes Australia a wonderful place to live. We all have to be accepting and skilled in interacting with fellow Australians who may be from different cultural backgrounds. I, as a First Nation Australian, embrace the cultural diversity of our nation, and in particular especially welcome people that have come to this country as refugees. All of us here, present and beyond this place, we are here due to what has happened in the past. We are a consequence of what has gone before us. For all of us to know and understand the historical truths of Australia's colonial history is the only way forward in a modern day Australia. The Uluru Statement from the Heart is a declaration by Aboriginal people about how we can move forward and have our place constitutionally recognised in contemporary Australian society. 12 years ago, on the 13th of February 2008, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd gave the apology to the stolen generation on behalf of all Australians. As part of that apology, he asked Aboriginal people, and I quote, to accept the apology in the spirit in which it is given, end quote. I request similar of you, to find out, to know and to understand the truth of our shared history, and to know and understand and ultimately embrace the Uluru Statement in the same way Kevin Rudd asked of us. In the spirit in which it was given, with an open heart and an open mind. The Uluru Statement will in time become one of the most important and significant documents in the history of this nation, Australia. We must all understand it and use it as a catalyst for leadership and change, leading our communities into a better future for us all. Kaya Wanju, Nankwell, Simon Forrest, Burungu, Nala Buja, Kaya Wanju Nidja Katanini, Curtin University. Kaya Wanju Wajala Budia, the Honourable Kim Beazley. Kaya Wanju Nidja Wajak Nunga Buja. Nala Karich Nunga Mod, Kain Karat Nidja Buja, Nan Karich Nunga Gabali, Boran Korye, Budawan, and thank you.
Thank you, Professor Forrest, for that wonderful welcome. It's a real privilege for all of us to be living and meeting on Wajak Noongar Budja. And I think also, as always, Simon, you remind us of our place in this country, but in fact our place in the world, and the importance of truth-telling as we walk together on the path to reconciliation. So thank you again. So Kaya from me also, and welcome to the 2021 John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library Anniversary Lecture, My name's Catherine Clark, and I'm the University Librarian here at Curtin University, and also, very importantly for today, I'm the Director of the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library. So my job today is MC, so I have a few instructions to relay to start with. So first of all, if you haven't already done so, can I ask you to switch your mobile phone either off or on to silent? And also, of course, we are trying to encourage everyone to adhere to the various physical distancing guidelines, and hopefully you've all checked in outside or filled in the mandatory contact register. If you do feel unwell, please notify one of our event staff and they will be able to assist you. My final instruction is, in the unlikely event of an emergency, unlikely and unlucky, I would say, event of an emergency, where we're required to evacuate, we have doors at the front of the lecture theatre but also at the back, and the nearest muster point is in a car park outside the building, but I think the best instruction I can give is listen out for the event staff who will lead you to the best place for you. So the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library Anniversary Lecture, we usually actually hold it in July, and that's because it commemorates the anniversary of John Curtin's death on the 5th of July 1945, only months prior to the end of World War II. Curtin was the only Australian Prime Minister to represent a West Australian seat in the House of Reps, and led his country, of course, during the most critical phase of World War II. And I think many of you would have heard references to Curtin during the recent pandemic and his leadership, and references and comparisons between what we're facing today. So the JCPML recognises Curtin's significant contribution to Australian society. And this year for our lecture, we're absolutely delighted to welcome the Honourable Kim Beazley AC, Governor of Western Australia, as our guest speaker. And I'm pleased to say that we've had the Governor speak with us before, although not when you were in that particular role, but this is a 20-year anniversary since the Honourable Kim Beazley AC last delivered the JCPML Anniversary Lecture, so the timing seems perfect. And also to commemorate the occasion, the Honourable Gillard AC, who's the patron of our Prime Ministerial Library, has recorded a special message that we'll play prior to hearing from the Governor. So it's now my pleasure to introduce Curtin University's Vice-Chancellor, Professor Harlene Hayne, ONZM, to officially welcome you.
Kaya, and good evening, everyone. Simon, thank you very much for your very warm welcome to country. It is with deep respect that I recognise that we have the privilege this evening of meeting on the traditional lands of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. And here at Curtin University, we are highly committed to teaching and learning in partnership with our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander colleagues. I'd like to give all of you a very warm welcome to the 2021 John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library Anniversary Lecture. Now, before I make some introductory comments, I would like to acknowledge many of our distinguished guests who are here with us this evening. The presenter of this year's JCPML Anniversary Lecture, the Honourable Kim Beazley AC, Governor of Western Australia. Welcome, Governor. Ms. Hannah Beazley, MLA, our local member for Victoria Park, and the daughter of our very proud guest speaker. It's fantastic to have you here, Hannah, and I'm sure your father agrees with me. Our Consul Generals and current and former members of Parliament, members of the Curtin family, who I had the opportunity to meet with briefly during afternoon tea. It's fantastic to have family members here with us. And Emeritus Professor Lance Toomey AO, former Vice-Chancellor of Curtin University. Now, since 1998, the JCPML Anniversary Lecture has been held to commemorate the contributions of Prime Minister John Curtin, after whom this university is proudly named. Curtin University established the Prime Ministerial Library to preserve John Curtin's personal papers and to make them publicly accessible, and to recognize his immense social and political achievements. Now, events such as this particular lecture provide an opportunity not only to reflect on the enduring legacy of John Curtin, but also to engage with the views of thought leaders and commentators in this period in our history. One of my first favorite memories of coming to Curtin was being shown through the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library, and I had the opportunity to look at and to touch and examine the extraordinary treasures, including handwritten notes to and from his wife, Elsie, and drafts of his incredibly powerful speeches. Now, the more I learned about John Curtin, the more I realized what a fitting namesake he is for this university. In Curtin's own words, we must look forward, we must seek, we must hope, but we must do this in a spirit of compassion and with a sense of inclusion. It must be a journey not only for the bold and for the brave, the healthy and the strong. The whole of this nation, in all of its diversity, must be on board. John Curtin's personal adherence to this fundamental concept of social justice and basic fairness, and the innate belief that all people are born equal and should surely underpin any university. But I'm very proud to say that these fundamental concepts are part of the DNA here at Curtin. The JCPML Anniversary Lecture is one of the most prestigious events on the Curtin University calendar. Past lectures have been presented by a number of previous prime ministers, including Gough Whitlam, Paul Keating, and Malcolm Fraser, as well as many other significant figures from politics, academia, and the arts and public sector. Now this year, the 2021 JCPML Anniversary Lecture is to be presented by the Honourable Kim Beazley AC, Governor of Western Australia, on what, as Catherine told us, is the 20th anniversary since he delivered the 4th John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library Anniversary Lecture in 2001, when he was the leader of the federal opposition. The JCPML website has a recording and a transcript of his 2001 speech, which we might have to check up on later today, where he was introduced by the JCPML patron of the time, the Honourable Gough Whitlam AC, Australia's 21st Prime Minister. Now this evening, the Governor will be introduced by our current patron, the Honourable Julia Gillard, the 27th Prime Minister of Australia and the first female Prime Minister of this country. She had very much hoped to be here in person to introduce her friend and former colleague, Kim Beazley, but due to travel restrictions, she has not been able to do so. However, she has sent the next best thing, a recorded introduction which we will present very shortly. Now, as you will be aware, the Honourable Julia Gillard served as Prime Minister of Australia from 2010 to 2013. Post-politics, she has continued to contribute to areas that reflect her long-standing commitment and passion for education and female leadership. Her post-political roles have included Chair of the Global Partnership for Education, a leading organization dedicated to expanding access and quality education worldwide. Patron of the Campaign for Female Education, which tackles poverty and inequality by supporting girls to go to school and to succeed, and empowering young women to step up as leaders of change. She's the chair of Beyond Blue, Australia's leading mental health awareness body. She's the inaugural chair of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. She is a distinguished fellow of the Centre for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution in Washington, and she is the chair of the Wellcome Trust. She's also an award-winning podcaster, winning the Spotlight Award for her Female Empowerment podcast, a podcast of one's own, at the 2021 Australian Podcasts Award in Sydney on Thursday night. Now, as she said at the time, if you told me one day I'd be hosting my own podcast, let alone winning awards for one, I would have said, I've got about as much chance of doing that as becoming Australia's first female Prime Minister. Now, the Global Institute for Women's Leadership podcast showcased the stories of diverse women leaders around the globe. And as Julia explained, progress on gender equality is not just slow. In some places, it's reversing. This lack of movement, combined with the current public debate about how women are treated in workplaces and wider society, means there has never been a better time to tackle these issues head-on. Now, in addition to her global roles, Ms. Gillard is having a special impact here at Curtin. We are privileged to offer the Julia Gillard Women in Leadership Scholarship that was established in 2019 to recognize her commitment to education, particularly her support of women to develop the skills required to become leaders. Now, I could go on all night highlighting her contributions to Australia and the rest of the world, but I think it is now time for us to hear directly from her. It is my great pleasure to present the introductory message for the 2021 JCPML Anniversary Lecture from the Honourable Julia Gillard.
Good evening to all of you gathered for this important event. I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which you meet, and in a spirit of reconciliation, I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I am disappointed not to be able to join you in person, but through the magic of technology, I join you from London, where I am continuing my work with the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College and my role as chair of the Wellcome Trust. But tonight I address you in my capacity as patron of the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library, and I am delighted to have the privilege of introducing tonight's esteemed guest to deliver our anniversary lecture for 2021, Kim Beazley. The purpose of these anniversary lectures is to connect Curtin's wartime courageous leadership and nation-building work to modern political thoughts and ideas. Since the inaugural oration in 1998 by our first patron and former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, our lectures have attracted notable academics and authors, scholarly and legal minds, prominent Australians, international guests, and perhaps unsurprisingly, a good number of parliamentarians. Tonight's lecture is delivered in the shadow of a year and a half that has tested our resilience and continues to test us. While I wonder what wisdom and advice Curtin might have had for weathering this pandemic, I have been grateful for the foundation he laid to get us through. Instituted by the Curtin government in early 1943, the National Welfare Fund and the unemployment, sickness and pharmaceutical benefits that followed established the framework that has been pivotal to Australia at this difficult time. Tonight's speaker is an advocate for sharing Curtin's legacy, and over 30 years ago, he was part of the early committee driving this library forward. He is no stranger to our stage, having delivered the 2001 Anniversary Lecture. He is also a maker of Labor history and a man who has spent more than 40 years in active public service. The Honourable Kim Beazley AC, Governor of Western Australia, is a great Australian and a leader whom people speak of with fondness and respect. Like Curtin, he has great concern for others and a keen scholarly intellect which he can translate into real ideas and action. Kim's life in politics and his connection to Curtin began early. His father succeeded John Curtin as federal member for the seat of Fremantle after Curtin's death in 1945. In 1980, Kim entered the national political arena himself, spending 27 years in Parliament and 13 years in the federal ministry. In this time, his great love of the defence portfolio earned him the moniker Bomber Beazley. In 1996, Kim replaced Paul Keating as Labor leader. Kim had the tough job of readying the team for government from opposition, and then he had to rebuild our spirits when we narrowly lost in 1998. When you are in the thick of political life, one doesn't imagine what life will be like after it. But Kim led the way in showing how to deploy the formidable skills he amassed in service of his nation. Kim was appointed our ambassador to the United States of America in 2009. Kim strengthened our bonds with the US in concert with Curtin's recognition of the strategic imperative to align our nation's security interests. Curtin's far-sighted foreign policy approach some 70 odd years ago has proved to be greatly beneficial to Australia, and Kim has been instrumental in our contemporary relations. I visited Kim in Washington in 2011, and wherever I went, I heard US leaders, including the President, sing his praises. Across my own life in politics, so I've been with Kim in Parliament House in Canberra and in Congress in Washington, DC. I have joined him in electorate events all around the country, but wherever he physically was, you could tell a big part of his heart was in Western Australia. He loves his state, and in turn, he is held in the highest regard by the people of the West. This mutual affection culminated in Kim being appointed as Governor in May 2018. Please join me in welcoming the Honourable Kim Beazley AC, Governor of Western Australia, to deliver the 2021 John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library Anniversary Lecture.
That's the nicest introduction I've ever had. Thanks, Julia. I remember her visits to Washington very well. She was a well-considered person and a courageous person. She used to, these days it's very difficult to talk about the Afghan war, but she was an individual who really focused the American mind on what actually needed to be done in Afghanistan, particularly in regard to Afghan women. And she led the Nato lot out, putting in resources and funds for the effort that was then being made in Afghanistan so the burden didn't fall totally on the Americans. And she has had the most stellar after-political career of anybody I know. She's been really extraordinary. Could I also acknowledge Simon and thank him again for his welcome to country. Simon's welcomes are different from those that you often get because he challenges us. So he welcomes us and gives us a mission. And I do appreciate that fact that you do that. And indeed, what you have suggested we should do, I do believe should be constitutionally formed. So that's thanks again for that introduction, for that welcome to all of us here. And could I also acknowledge here, of course, the Vice-Chancellor. Lovely to be with you. It's always a privilege to be here and speak, and I do love the Vice-Chancellors that there have been here. And Catherine, thanks for setting all of this up. And I've got so many members of Parliament I need to acknowledge. The Honourable Clara Andrich, MLC, is a member for South Metropolitan Region. The Honourable Lorna Harper, MLC, member for East Metropolitan Region. The Honourable Dr Brad Pettit, MLC, member for South Metropolitan Region. The Honourable Matthew Dean Swinburne, MLC, member for East Metropolitan Region, Parliamentary Secretary to the Attorney-General, Minister for Electoral Affairs. Ms Hannah Beazley, MLA, member for Victoria Park, lovely to see you here. As Gough Whitlam used to say about me, as opposed to my father, I'd say about her, the better Beazley. And Mr Jeff Baker, MLA, member for South Perth. Dr Andrew Crane, who's the Chancellor here at Curtin University. Emeritus Professor Lance Toomey, AO, and Mrs Meg Toomey, distinguished guests all. I'm starting a bit later, but I'm not going to cut anything out, so you might just have to miss out on your tea tonight. That's because this is a very important lecture for all the reasons that various people have stated during the course of introducing me and introducing the event. But I firstly acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, and I do pay my respects to their elders past and present and stand in awe of their survival of successive ice ages as the last one, the only formed community in the world at that point of time. Well now, since 1976, Australia's national strategy has been self-reliance within the framework of our alliances. That view had been percolating in Australian official circles and to a degree in the academic community and politics since the early 1960s. What cemented it was an announcement in 1969 by President Richard Nixon as he restructured American global policy in the process of dismantling the dominance of the Vietnam War in American military planning and strategic thinking. Southeast Asia was relegated to a second-order priority in the regional context of the US view of the then central balance. In areas like that within which Australia was located, American allies were expected to provide for their security themselves in the first instance. Now, hosting facilities critical to the American deterrent meant we were not a normal second-order security partner, whatever our geography happened to indicate. Policy rarely reflects a singular source, but our experience in the Vietnam War and the acquisition of weapons like with a major strike capability like F-111 bombers and submarines produced a level of confidence we could, at least in our approaches, handle complex problems. Nixon's prescription was doable and imposed a useful clarity on our task. Forces could be deployed elsewhere, as signalled by us in 1971 when we joined the five-power defence arrangement, along with Britain, New Zealand, Singapore and Malaysia, for the protection of the Malayan Peninsula that still exists, though we don't talk about it. Rather than anxiety creating, the Guam Doctrine was liberating. The Americans could be surprised, however, by the consequences of that liberation. I remember explaining the 1987 Defence White Paper to my counterpart, the late Caspar Weinberger, who was not enamoured of the possibility of a lesser forward deployment in Australia's thinking, that the US had sent us down the path with the Nixon Doctrine when I pointed it out to him. His response was, well, that doctrine is not necessarily the one the US has now. We would defend you, you know, he said. Yes, I knew, but it is a good discipline and a good basis for the burden sharing you constantly seek. Prior national strategy, from federation to 1976, at the political level was forward defence with great and powerful allies, and that was sustained through 2 world wars and conflict in Vietnam, Korea and Malaya. Of those conflicts, the one which in practice, for our defence planners and the political leadership, reflected a closer experience in reality to contemporary national security policy was the Second World War. John Curtin was the only Australian Prime Minister to date whose government faced an existential threat. That point when you realise, as I used to when I was Defence Minister, there is absolutely no reason why we should be here. None whatsoever that would be necessarily recognised by anyone else as the only nation that sits in an entire continent, and we replaced about 350 of them when we turned up here. There was no reason we should exist. The only reason we existed was that we were capable of sustaining it. But mostly you never realise that. Curtin was forced to. Though he never stated his strategy in contemporary terms, he ran a strategy out of necessity of self-reliance within the framework of our alliances. That he might have to do so, he anticipated when he stated in 1936 the dependence of Australia upon the competence, let alone the readiness, of British statesmen to send forces to our aid is too dangerous a hazard upon which to found Australian defence policy. Well, it was one thing to understand that. Easy enough when contemplating the military and war policies of Axis powers thrusting toward conflict in both Europe and the Pacific. It was another thing to know what to do about it. The US had the capacity to relieve on both fronts. In the 1930s, however, the United States was isolationist. The experience of World War I had soured any desire for a further European adventure. Though increasingly hostile to Japanese ambitions in China, and maybe further afield as the American position in the Philippines and Hawaii was considered, any notion of defending the British Empire in Asia was completely rejected by the American people and pretty much by the leadership. That left, what could we do for ourselves? The impact of the Depression meant, in reality, very little. We had a large militia, but it was terribly armed. The beginnings of some naval and aircraft production, but very small, and hardly to be compared with Japanese capabilities. The British and we had 2 strokes of luck. For the British, it was in the late 1930s, the construction of a brilliant air defence, really way ahead of its time. Good aircraft production with Spitfires and Hurricanes, able to handle at a pinch Luftwaffe equivalents and their bombers, dispersed airfields, advanced radar to optimise the use of the dispersed fighters, British and American radar, and they were the most advanced, well in advance of the Germans and Japanese, was entirely dependent for its effectiveness, its added effectiveness, on a mineral, tantalum. That, at that time, it was produced only on one place on Earth. That was a mine in Western Australia's north. Then and throughout the war, we supplied both powers by air once the danger of sunk shipping became too high. The amounts needed were light enough to be so supported. Well, think rare earths and critical minerals today. Our stroke of luck was ESington Lewis. He was the head of BHP. In the 1930s, he visited both Germany and Japan, but it was Japan which worried him. They were much more secretive than the Germans. He began a massive stockpiling of iron and steel way beyond the needs of BHP. Can you imagine that in today's reverence for market forces, anyone would do that? He laid the basis for a massive expansion of Australia's war industries, in charge of which he was placed during the war. In the end, those industries and what they did for Australia's and America's armed forces, together with what we did in expanding ours during the conflict, looked remarkably like what we'd think of in our days as self-reliance. Then there was the question of alliances. One quote from Curtin's article in the Herald, Melbourne, on the 27th of December 1941, "The task ahead," is often quoted as we discuss the origins of the American alliance. He wrote, "Without any inhibitions of any kind, I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom. We know the problems the UK faces, we know the constant threat of invasion, we know the dangers of dispersal of strength, but we know too that Australia can go and Britain can still hang on." Neither Churchill nor FDR was happy with that speech. Both prioritised defeating Germany. We did not desert them. It also has to be pointed out that the Australian 9th Division played a major role in the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, almost a year later. Throughout the war, many Australian airmen fought and lost their lives in all British air commands. However, the other Australian divisions were brought home from the Middle East over Churchill's constant efforts to keep them, then divert them to Burma. Your grandfather and your father and great-grandfather was a remarkably courageous man. We can think of pulling out of that sort of pressure now, but you couldn't then. Those divisions, plus the 9th Division after El Alamein, were decisive in the campaigns in New Guinea, which made General Douglas MacArthur's name. It was not until 1944 that MacArthur had more American servicemen under his command than Australian. Curtin never lost his belief in Britain. Towards the end of the war, he fought hard to create an alliance relationship in which Britain resumed its stance in the Far East, albeit he sought substantial Australian influence over the development of the military policy to be adopted. That being said, in 1942 it was all about America. And I think that the spirit of that was best reflected in what I think is the best short speech ever made by an Australian Prime Minister. Though some argue that Keating's speech at the installation of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier was better. Curtins was made in extremity and made off the cuff. And it was on the adjournment of the House in the middle of the Battle of the Coral Sea, so the fight was on. You all should read it. The naval battle was fought in part of what is now Australia's exclusive economic zone. We sort of assume, it was up there, Solomon's Head. No, it wasn't. Next door, in our waters. That's where the Battle of the Coral Sea was fought. It was that close. It blocked a Japanese effort to attack head-on into Port Moresby. The Allied forces were 2 American carrier task forces and an Australian cruiser squadron, which included an American cruiser. The cruiser squadron took the first attack. But they had learned from the shock loss of the 2 British battleships, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse off Malaya. They placed themselves in a diamond formation and shot the attackers to pieces, sustaining very little damage themselves. The carriers finally found each other and engaged. The Americans lost a carrier and had another, the Yorktown, damaged. The Japanese lost most of their air wing and an escort carrier. An interesting coda to the action was provided by a Japanese surveillance aircraft who came out just after all of that had taken place and determined that the Australian cruisers were in fact 3 American battleships. And the thought of that and confronting American and Australian land-based air power without their own air cover, the invasion was called off. The reward for the Americans came a month later at the Battle of Midway, when the Japanese went from an intended 6 carriers to 4. Up against the 3 American carriers, who had the advantage of surprise, they lost 3 carriers in 6 minutes. The 4th, no longer surprised, destroyed the Coral Sea American carrier Survivor. The other 2 American carriers destroyed it. For the Australians, our reward was that the Japanese had to do Port Moresby by land. Their last attempt at an indirect approach produced the Battle of Milne Bay, when at Australian behest they lost their first land battle. Then it was Kokoda. The Japanese believed they saw the lights of Port Moresby. I like to think it was the muzzle flashes of the artillery of the divisions brought home from the Middle East as the Japanese began their bloody retreat. Now, Curtin was our most literary Prime Minister, devoted to poetry and great prose. And in his speech, he borrowed a phrase from Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. As I speak, those who are participating in this engagement are conforming to the sternest discipline and are subjecting themselves with all they have. It may be for many of them, then Lincoln, the last full measure of their devotion to accomplish the increased safety and security of this territory. Now, realistically assess the possibility we might not win. Then the fight would be harder, he said, and he finished with a clarion call. I put it to any man whom my words may reach, that he owes it to those men and to the future of the country not to be stinting in what he will do now for Australia. Men are fighting for Australia today. Those who are not fighting for Australia have no excuse for not working. Well, work and fight they did, but not only men, also women. Single women were civilly conscripted. That meant that they were at the disposal, in that delightful expression of being man-powered. Married women were put under intense pressure to join them. Women had been prominent in nursing in the First World War, and that's still important, but now in many branches of the armed services. Heavily in intelligence, but also in flying aircraft to the frontline squadrons of the North, basically all women pilots. We were the most mobilised country in the fight, much more mobilised than Nazi Germany, much more mobilised than the Soviet Union, more mobilised than the US, more mobilised than the UK. In war industry, women were critical. Some 10,000 of the most highly skilled of them achieved male pay rates. We were so mobilised we ran out of women. In 1944, we demobilised a division to help out. When MacArthur complained, the British Imperial General Staff intervened and told him that Australia was feeding Britain and supporting him and to bug out. An analysis of the War Memorial points out Australia's war economy provided vast amounts of clothing to hundreds of thousands of American service personnel in the Southwest Pacific. Huge quantities of basic materials for road and base building, as well as armament, transport and signal equipment were also supplied. In 1943, Australia supplied 95% of the food for 1 million American servicemen. President Harry Truman, reporting to Congress in 1946 on the Lend-Lease Act, said, "On balance, the contribution made by Australia, a country having a population of about 7 million, approximately equalled that of the United States." Not quite right. We were the only ally of the US who supplied more, a debt we forgave at the end of the conflict. In terms of employment in important Australian industries from 1939 to 1946, increases were as follows. Cement and cement goods, 50%. Mineral oils, 170%. Smelting and converting of metals, 25%. Aeroplanes, 250%. Ships and boats, 150%. Cutlery and small tools, 180%. Dye works and cleaning, 110%. Paper making, 90%. Surgical, optical and scientific instruments, 260%. In the light of recent submarine discussions, another contribution might be mentioned. Fremantle was the largest US submarine base after Pearl Harbor. From there, about 1/3 of Japanese shipping was sunk. A smaller base in Brisbane was useful in the Solomon Islands campaign. I have immense respect for my diplomatic predecessors in the US, particularly Sir Owen Dixon, taken off the High Court to be ambassador from 1942 to 1944. I could only dream of his contacts. He joined the Pacific War Council, chaired by FDR, which met usually weekly. Apart from FDR, he often met key figures like Secretary of State Cordell Hull, Secretary of War Henry Stimson, members of the Combined Joint Chiefs of Staff, Lend-Lease Administrator and Special Assistant to the President Edward Stettinius. Dixon was the go-to man because they and their other senior officials respected him and were happy to give him the hard messages they wanted transferred back to Australia. There were lots of hard messages transferred back to Australia during the war because most in Washington hated our Commanding General, General Douglas MacArthur, and we also ourselves were not very popular. It was hard to get through the messages in that fraught and complex environment, that we were making a massive contribution and we should not be judged by the needling they were getting from Bert Everett and, of course, from the General. We had only just opened our embassy. Dixon had a direct line to Curtin. He didn't have to report to Everett. In the end, FDR and Churchill came to like and respect Curtin. We were there to the very end. Our landings in Borneo were the last amphibious operations of the Pacific War. Not Iwo Jima or Okinawa. Our landings in Borneo were the last amphibious landings of the Pacific War. Looking back through the lens of contemporary national strategy, how did we look in 1945? With regard to self-reliance in terms of production and mobilisation, really quite extraordinary. Our main ally in our region depended on us. In terms of our military, we had high quality and success in all three branches. We could not have succeeded without American help, directly and indirectly, though, through their own struggles near us in Guadalcanal and the Central Pacific. Really, probably the American fight in Guadalcanal was responsible for our success in New Guinea, because the Japanese command in Rabaul found themselves confronting a two-front war. The Americans in Guadalcanal, the Australians in New Guinea, and they had to weigh which direction they would go in. Towards the end of those struggles, which were fought simultaneously, they put more troops into the American machine against the Americans, which was a meat grinder. Ours was a meat grinder, but not of the same proportions, so we lost a lot more than the Americans did. In their struggle with Guadalcanal, I think they lost about 1,500. I think we lost closer to 20,000 in New Guinea. So we could not have succeeded, however, without that. And of course, their extraordinary strategic courage in committing 2 carriers to blocking a landing at Port Moresby. That meant we held that pivotal position. Losing it would quite possibly have knocked us out of the war. However, in 1942-3, our soldiers carried the bulk of the New Guinea campaign. Though retreating, we were carrying all of the early phase. Triumphant elsewhere, the Japanese were slowly getting to comprehend they had a harder fight. We would not have used terms like self-reliance to discuss this picture, though we approached it. What we learned again was the need for great and powerful friends, with a crash course in cultivating a new one. Diplomatically, we learned how to engage, who to talk to, how to develop a presentable structure of our needs. Militarily, we learned how to collaborate in the domains of battle. Strategically, we learned what mattered in our approaches and where we wanted our friends to be. What we did not get was long-term commitments. In moving to contemporary times, I would identify 4 inflection points in our relationship with the Americans. The first was the ANZUS Treaty, negotiated in 1951, and we have its 70th anniversary this year. The second, in the 1960s, was the creation of what I would call the modern American alliance with the negotiation of the joint facilities. The third was the 1980s, when we put flesh on the bones of self-reliance within our alliances. The fourth has been the negotiation of AUKUS. History doesn't repeat itself, nor even necessarily rhyme. The strategic structure of our region, however, contains within it forces and directions potentially deeply troublesome enough to challenge the verities developed at the time of that third inflection point, and with a passing resemblance to the 1930s challenges. When we did ANZUS, we had before us the emerging example of NATO collective defence. What we had in our zone was participation in the structure of what was called the San Francisco system, a hub-and-spoke arrangement with US as hub and a series of spokes at Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, Taiwan, ANZUS. By no means all of the equivalent status, and none with the military character of NATO. Our spoke was a reward for supporting a peace treaty with Japan. Very deliberately, the US military ensured it held nothing of the deep complexities of their commitment to NATO. In the 1950s, we were, South Korea accepted, engaged as much with the British as with America, even with our support for CETO, which both other powers sat. The US Defence Secretary, Robert McNamara, dramatically changed that with his determination to secure the capabilities in the Southern Hemisphere necessary to support his triad of strategic forces. So a bloke almost nobody whose name is known in this room, I suspect. Robert McNamara, he founded the American Alliance. The late, great Des Ball described them as the strategic essence of the American relationship. Essentially, Northwest Cape was vital then for communication with ballistic missile submarines, which was the US's second strike capability. Narungga doubled American early warning time of a Soviet nuclear attack and now exists as a redundant capability shifted to Pine Gap. But then American early warning time off the distant early warning radar system was 15 minutes. A president with his football could launch a strike in 15 minutes. The Narungga gave the American president 30 minutes. So that gap of 15 minutes would enable the American Space Command headquarters, or Strategic Command headquarters, to determine whether or not the Aurora Borealis was what it was, or a massive Soviet missile strike. Pine Gap was essential for an understanding of Soviet missile capability, and now it is very much more than that. Should perhaps, I think this needs to be thought about very carefully and clearly by us, should perhaps a mistaken calculation by another power involve an attack on them or the satellites they serve, the globe would either be in a nuclear war or on the verge of it. The 1980s, in the context of the times, created for us here genuine self-reliance. We had the ability to handle then identified escalated low-level threats ourselves without directly involving the Americans. That was the objective. It also changed the character of the joint facilities. They then became part of the Australian order of battle as well as of the American order of battle, because the Americans shared the operation with us genuinely. They are now genuine joint facilities with many Australians in command of shifts, many Australians working there in the business end of it, as there are Americans, and serving our own surveillance needs in the region around us. Northwest Cape became our best means of communication with our own submarines. Less relevant, though, for the Americans, so we took it over. In its vicinity, however, other space-related joint facilities have recently been established. Pine Gap, we negotiated a level of Australian involvement, as I said, which made it critical for our read on the region. Now, this brief reading can go no further, except to say the capabilities are vastly greater than I was Defence Minister, and our integration much deeper. We were focused for what we then described on our force in being, to handle what was around us in capability. Incorporated in our force structure as well were elements capable of dealing with higher level threats, which we described as part of an expansion base. A threat which would require us to augment those latter capabilities we calculated would take 15 years to emerge. Calculating those developments closely focused on the concept of warning time. Well, 15 years is up. Warning time, except in the sense of an actual movement of forces, is over. Our level of dependence on the United States now, as opposed to then, has massively increased. Our defence planners face a massive conundrum. How much of an effort has to be placed on the here and now? And what effort has to be put into the longer term? Right now, there is the question of hardening our facilities and establishing war stocks. Our facilities are vulnerable. What do we need to do about hardening? Some of that involves what it suggests, building much more defence into what exists. Just as important is dispersal. Remembering for all of this, we will have no time. We are now in the long run-up. Think of us as a fast bowler. We have started running. The question is, at what point are we going to deliver the ball? Or is the ball going to have to be delivered, or a balking away from the crease done by the fast bowler on the way up. This is over. That the time when we could have a sort of sense of relaxed calculation, finished, no longer there. But if you take a look at where we are now, in what we have to hand in these circumstances, you would not necessarily be overly happy. We will fight at that point of delivery with whatever it is we had at the time. How do we hide, protect and secure the necessary supplies, be they fuel, ammunition or spares? What missile capabilities do we add to our aircraft, ships, submarines and soldiers? How do we get the numbers that we need in platforms and personnel? Having an ESington Lewis around is no longer enough. I can only have the deepest sympathy for those who are now engaged in sorting this. The price of failure on my part as a minister or my department was actually very small. Now it might be existential. And it's not just defence. What defence does is establish deterrence. Diplomatically, that's an invaluable tool. For other portfolios, notably DFAT, PM&C, Transport, Home Affairs, Attorney Generals, the task as best they can perform it is to create relationships in the region which builds confidence, and at home, plan and secure mobilisation. Negotiation of AUKUS is an important part of that diplomatic process, particularly how we explain it. For immediate military purposes, it could also help the processes I've described. Though it is not an alliance, it has clearly focused our main ally on our needs and situation. The Americans now talk about us more than I've ever seen them do it. So they are thinking about us quite intensely. Our ally does not want war. It wants to avoid it. It clearly hopes for a peaceful region. I know many of their main decision makers, and they are not about frustrating reasonable ambitions. They're about creating an environment of respect and sovereignty. They want top global priorities to be focused on the resolution of climate change and pandemics. That's what they want to worry about. They don't actually want to have to worry about what I've been talking about. They have to, in those infamous words, be able to chew gum and walk at the same time. Much of AUKUS is, however, focused on the long term, not simply the acquisition of nuclear submarines, but also about technologies and supply chains, important both for the military and civilian purposes. Finally, I would like to discuss these from a West Australian point of view. Many of them engage our territory, our mining, our industries, our research, and our people. We are the world's greatest mineral province. With our other attributes, we would be the number one target in this country. I don't any longer think about, as we used to in my day, the raids and that sort of thing. I do think about territorial seizure. You don't want to destroy what we've got, you want to have what we've got. We haste the Royal Australian Navy's main submarine base. Therefore, we are deeply engaged in the submarine changes. Our conventional submarines are the world's best. I remember as ambassador visiting Groton, the home of Electric Boat, one of the production facilities of the US's Virginia-class submarines. I went on board one of them and I entered the control room. The captain said to me, "Recognise anything?" I said, "Yes. I am standing in the control room of a Collins-class submarine." "Yes," he said. "I served on one as an exchange officer, one of the best I have ever been on. You have solved a range of issues of integration of all systems, which we have been very pleased to adopt. If that is the boat that we get in the end, it will be totally familiar. apart from its nuclear engine, to Australian submariners. We also have, I might add, a range of WA companies that are expert in underwater technologies, valuable not only for our miners, but also sensing for military purposes and deployment of weapons. We are in so many areas way ahead of the rest of the world. And in these specifics, we are too. When we built the Collins, it was one of the few submarines in the region. As a conventional boat, its operations, though capable everywhere, is most lethal in archipelagic water. There are a number of entry points to Australian waters through the archipelago, and it would be decisive in those areas. Since then, there has been a massive increase in the number of submarines in our region. Many of them are nuclear powered. We face a threat in the open ocean, just the archipelago. Speed counts in defending our approaches and around our coast. The archipelagic issues remain, and the value of the Collins remains well into the future. I just wish I'd got my proposal for 8 of them up. But for the broad ocean areas, a nuclear-powered submarine is essential, and that has been recognised on a bipartisan basis. But AUKUS is also about joint research and development on a range of technologies: cyber, artificial intelligence, quantum technologies, hypersonics, wider undersea technologies, standoff strike, industrial bases and supply chains. I've already mentioned undersea technologies. UWA has a quantum physics lab. We have supercomputing capabilities here around this campus, which among other things supports the square kilometre array. On artificial intelligence and robotics, our mining companies are the world's most advanced in robotics. NASA believes their capabilities are ahead of their own in key areas. Edith Cowan heads the CRC on cyber security for Australia and has spun off capacities for companies and functions including the Sabian Cyber and the WA Police Technical Crime Unit. On hypersonics, we have hyperpower technologies, and Murdoch University has had an initial engagement on that with Defence. There are others engaged. Orbital UAVs sell to the US Navy. In AI, we also have Chironics. In industrial bases and supply chains, we have critical capacities. Lynas has the world's largest rare earth mine. There are other mines as well. A vital product for weapons systems, and where China has a near monopoly. We think back to tantalum, an equivalent is now Coogee titanium, a unique sovereign capability, the only Five Eyes source of manufactured titanium, an enormous share of world titanium powder production for new technologies. That's us. Similar to rare earths, the world's magnesium supply is strategic, critical to additive manufacturing and military applications. China has a world monopoly here too, so Coogee Titanium's WA operation also offers a vital magnesium powder source for modern technology and military applications. Well, this has been a summary, but there are numbers of other companies and research institutions I haven't been able to mention. There's a stack of them here, actually. Our minerals and our associated capabilities, particularly in battery and magnet technologies, are critical in these supply chain issues. When I was Defence Minister, I always found it helpful to talk about capabilities we had to deal with, not countries. The problem I used to say when I used to talk about dealing with capabilities, if I talked about the countries which have them, I might start a fight. Well, it's not so easy these days. In John Curtin's day, we mounted as a people a massive defence effort. Despite that, then we understood completely our survival and independence depended on a gigantic allied effort. There is so much we can do for ourselves, particularly in the area of diplomacy in our region and further afield. We have to stand for the prosperity and security of our region. We also need a laser-like focus on the issues that we've been discussing here. We are a democracy, so that means not just government, but also people. Curtin was confident we were up to the challenge then, we will be now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I feel I have learned so much about WA that I didn't know already, but also about the complexity and challenges of the diplomatic process, and clearly that is something you are very well aware of. But I think also some of those wonderful stories about the rare mineral that was only available in WA, stockpiling steel. I have 10 mini-series lined up, Governor, to pitch for. So thank you so much. It was really fantastic, and I think that the Honourable Julia Gillard will safely say that your reputation as Bomber Beazley is very much intact. I would now like to invite the Vice-Chancellor to come up and just give you a couple of small gifts to thank you. So that brings us to the end of the formal proceedings for this evening, and thank you so much everyone for joining us here. I would like to invite you to stay for a while if you can. We have refreshments outside in the courtyard next to the lecture theatre. So thank you and good evening.